Okay, welcome back in. We are continuing on with Chapter 6 in the OpenStax textbook, and right now looking at Section 6.4, Bone Development and Bone Growth. To begin our conversation, I want to talk about the fact that in a newly developing embryo, during the first 6 weeks of pregnancy, the embryo doesn't actually have any bones. In fact, the bones develop secondarily anywhere there is going to end up being a bone. So in other words, the entire skeletal outline of the embryo begins as either one of two things. Either it begins as a fibrous connective tissue membrane, which will eventually be replaced with bone, or it begins with a hyaline cartilage model of that bone. So for example, let's say the humerus. The humerus would begin with a chunk of hyaline cartilage that eventually gets replaced by bone. And we're going to talk about both of those kinds of bone formation. The first of which is the replacement of a fibrous connective tissue membrane with bone. And that's called intramembranous ossification. So here you see at the top, intramembranous ossification. And again, these are going to be places where a fibrous connective tissue membrane outlines where the bone will eventually be, and that membrane then gives rise to the formation of the bone. Okay, so we're going to talk about the steps involved in that. Now, the intramembranous ossification happens primarily in the flat bones of the skull. So, for example, the parietal bone, the frontal bone, those kinds of bones, and also most of the facial bones, the flat facial bones like the mandible and maxilla and so on. But also interestingly occurs in the clavicles. And so this intramembranous ossification begins with what we call mesenchymal cells. Some people pronounce that mesenchymal, and that's okay as well. I've just always heard it pronounced mesenchymal. But a mesenchymal cell is essentially a stem cell of connective tissue. And it's going to give rise to a number of different kinds of connective tissue cells, including chondrogenic cells, osteogenic cells, fibroblasts, all sorts of things. So it is a stem cell of connective tissue. What happens in intramembranous ossification is a bunch of these mesenchymal cells begin to aggregate in a location which we will eventually refer to as the ossification center. And what's happening is that they are continuously and mitotically dividing. And as they do, their daughter cells are differentiating into osteogenic cells, and eventually the osteogenic cells differentiate into osteoblasts. And so here you can see these mesenchymal cells have essentially differentiated into osteoblasts. The first job of the osteoblast within this ossification center is to begin secreting an extracellular substance known as osteoid. Now, osteoid is an unconsolidated bone material that's not calcified yet. And so the next step is for the osteoblast to begin secreting into this osteoid matrix calcium and other minerals, including phosphate. And these things then have to be or are used to calcify the matrix into something that's solid. That is catalyzed with an enzyme called alkaline phosphatase. And if you come look at picture B here to the right-hand side, you will notice that the osteoid here, pictured in blue, that's surrounding all of these osteoblasts, has now calcified into this concrete, if you will, solid bone matrix. And in so doing, it's trapped the osteoblasts in these little pockets called lacuna. And now those osteoblasts differentiate further into what we refer to as osteocytes. Now, the osteocytes, it's their job to maintain this cement that's all around them, this calcified bone. And they are quite capable of remodeling it or just, maintaining it. Now, if you look at the outside of this ossification center, you will see there are new osteogenic cells and osteoblasts that are continuing to form osteoid and expanding this ossification center. Once you watch them expand this enough, they begin to form what are called trabeculae. Now those usually begin in separate locations, little spicules of the new bone matrix and ossification centers begin spreading out, joining one another, and forming this lattice work of bone we call spongy bone. And so the first bone that is formed within an intramembranous ossification is this spongy bone. Now, notice that the external portion of this bone, both the surfaces below and above, are still lined with osteoblasts. That's what these cells are, osteoblasts. They are making up the inner portion of the periosteum. Remember, the outer portion is going to be made up of a dense fibrous irregular connective tissue. Here you see the mesenchyme is forming that. But here are osteoblasts that are continually contributing to the bony matrix here. Now, one of the things that happens is after the spongy bone reaches its full development and size, the osteoblasts begin to develop haversion systems, or osteons. As you recall, that's part of compact bone. And so here you have compact bone layer on the outside of the spongy and compact bone in here as well, being laid down by these osteoblasts. Also, the osteocytes, that are sunken and trapped within this osteoid calcified matrix, or that calcified matrix, are contributing to that bone, compact bone development as well. In the end, what you get with intramembranous ossification of these flat bones is that iconic plan that we looked at before, where you have a compact bone and then spongy bone and then more compact bone below. And we talked about the functionality and the reason for that. Notice that the blood vessels are, a lot of these trabeculae have been formed in a lattice work around the blood vessels. Typically at the end of development of an intramembranous ossification, this can get so crowded that these blood vessels join together and essentially produce red bone marrow. And so we can talk a little bit more about that in the later video, but that's the process here of intramembranous ossification.